Hello Eagles fans. Yesterday I released a video, or today by the time you're watching this, about how the deals were at a standstill around Tom Barrass and Liam Baker, so I'd take a day to talk about something else. And then sure enough, predictably, like a few hours after that video dropped, the whole thing's been thrown into flux. Okay, so I woke up this morning and checked my phone and saw the update that Hawthorn have traded pick 14 to Carlton, and Carlton have given Hawthorn a future first and second round picks, which effectively means the deal we thought we were getting, or at least the main piece of it, pick 14 for Tom Barrass, that cannot happen in that way anymore. So yeah, it was an interesting reaction. I was trying to read it while still like blurry-eyed, and I was looking at it and I was just like, what year is it? And then I went through like all 4 seasons in a day in terms of emotion with it. I was confused at first, and then, you know, at first I was kind of buoyed. I was like, well, if this scenario ruins every deal and we just end up with Tom Barrass and don't get Liam Baker, like I can live with that. And then that was followed by a bit of outrage and annoyance because, first of all, it was reported as though Hawthorn sort of did this behind West Coast back to some extent, which we'll touch on because I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. But it was reported that Hawthorn got tired of us not agreeing to their deal and went and did a side deal, which may or may not be true. So there was that, and then plus, you know, I kind of got a little bit annoyed by the idea that, well, West Coast's plan A was ruined, regardless of whether I thought the plan A was an amazing one anyway. I guess maybe there was an underlying concern of what happens if West Coast gets thrown into chaos now? We need to be saved from ourselves. You know, if plan A goes out the window, I'm worried that we're going to panic and try and get the deal done in a less attractive way than, you know, perhaps it was previously reported. And now, like, I went and got a coffee, I've come back, I've done a little bit of reading about what's being said, and I think ultimately I'm kind of back to an equilibrium now, where I'm not too sure how much this really ruins our plans by any stretch, and if anything, there could be a bigger flow on to Richmond than us. So let's get into it. As a side note, I do want to point this out. This was an interesting thing from Carlton here. Apparently Carlton, prior to doing that trade with Hawthorn, had offered us pick 12, a future first, and a future second round pick for pick 3. That's, like, on value, a pretty good deal. I'm not saying I want to have done that because I don't want to trade from 3 down to 12. I want to have a presence in this year's draft, but interesting. It also sort of signals that maybe they're not actually going for Dan Houston as hard as we thought. Anyway, that's a true footy topic. So the most immediate deal that gets affected here is that of Tom Barrass, where we previously sort of thought maybe pick 14 and a future second were going to come our way from Hawthorn. And it was also reported that Hawthorn weren't really too crash hot on that idea. And the reported trade that was in our inbox, our figurative inbox, was pick 14 this year and a future second next year, with us giving a future third back. Now, I think that's kind of a gross deal personally, but as it is reported, Hawthorn then got tired of us not giving a yes or no. Personally, I'm kind of glad we didn't accept that deal. And Hawthorn's gone and done a side deal and said, no, pick 14's off the table. Now they have gone and gotten a future first round pick and a future second round pick. So they've basically banked an extra future second round pick on the basis of doing this deal. So where does this leave the Tom Barrass deal? Well, pick 14's off the table. We can pretty much only deal in futures here with Hawthorn. Now, there is a distinct possibility they've pissed off West Coast, right? West Coast has said, well, screw you. And honestly, if that is the case, if I'm West Coast, I'm not even picking up the phone to Hawthorn. I'm just saying, okay, you can come to us again. And then I'd be pushing for 2 future firsts. Now, I don't know how realistic that is. If Hawthorn were unwilling to pay pick 14, they'd be unwilling to pay 2 future firsts, in my opinion. So that's probably not going to be the way this deal gets done. However, we can still deal in future picks. Now, pick 14 in this year's draft is probably more valuable than the equivalent pick in next year's draft if you believe what is being said about the strength of this draft and everyone trying to get into it. However, this doesn't really affect us. This is really more of a Richmond problem when you think about it, because pick 14 was going to Richmond for Liam Baker anyway. So if we hypothetically got one of Carlton or Hawthorn's future first round picks, which one you'd prefer is an interesting one. Like, I'm not too sure. You could make an argument either side could improve or fall away, or stay in the same spot. Like, it's actually hard, given Hawthorn certainly ended the year as the much better team, but being so young, they're quite vulnerable, and Carlton are a little bit all over the place. But anyway, that's a side note. So if we hypothetically got a future first and a future second from Hawthorn, that future first could be part of a deal to get Liam Baker over the line. So in essence, it really affects Richmond's draft hand this year, not ours, assuming that all parties agree to that deal. There's also a side note here where Hawthorn couldn't have traded a future first and a future second without doing this Carlton deal, because if you trade out your future first, you can't trade another future second out in that same draft without receiving a second round draft pick. So what this Carlton and Hawthorn deal has done in effect is allowed Hawthorn to trade a future first and a future second. Now, what's unclear was, will West Coast saying we want future picks instead? That seems a little odd to me, but again, remember, this is going to Richmond, not us. Now, Tom Morris did report. He said the Eagles are in favour of bolstering their 2025 hand, with the Hawks now holding 4 picks over the 2 rounds of next year's count. So, count? I've never heard a draft referred to as a count. Unless you're referring to count draft, you're like, oh wow, that's the worst joke I've ever made. So that is the first we've heard that West Coast were keen on 2025 picks. Whilst again acknowledging that presumably this was going to be wrapped up in the Liam Baker deal. So what is the benefit for us bolstering our future hand? So I suppose you could say there's a possibility we go for Hawthorn's future first and future second, and regrettably it might involve a future third from us going back. As gross as that is, I don't like that, but it's possible. But let's just say that's what we do. Well, then we're faced with the choice of trading Liam Baker for, say, one of those late future firsts and perhaps something back in this year's draft coming back, or we just purely deal with Liam Baker and pick 3. We're coming back to that gross scenario. So you could do some maths on this. Let's say pick 3 could get 6 and 18. I think that's pretty ballpark. Like at 6 and 14, I can understand why Richmond would balk at that. Anything much later than that's a little bit gross for us, but 3 for 6 and 18 is probably about right. So then you just replace pick 18 with Liam Baker and say, Richmond, you're getting pick 18. So again, that's not as good a deal for Richmond. So we'd move from 3 to 6 in this year's draft and still hold future first and a future second from Hawthorn in this scenario. So again, I really wanted more picks in this year's draft. So holding extra picks next year isn't that juicy to me. I can only imagine West Coast is doing this because they want to make a real bid at Chad Warner next year. But the thing is, in my opinion, I don't think we need an extra first round pick to target Chad Warner next year. I still think we're probably going to finish bottom 4, right? So if we hold picks 3 or 4 again in next year's draft, even if Fremantle have 2 late firsts or whatever they're going to hold if they strategically trade into next year's draft, like pick 3 is still pretty damn good and probably going to beat that out, especially when you can still trade other picks and future firsts, etc. So my preference would be to get picks in this year's draft and just go with our own individual first rounder next year and hold Hawthorn's future second, which was that was what was going to happen anyway. So one thing we could do is trade 3 and a future late first. This is already a bad start. It's gross, isn't it? The future late first from Carlton or Hawthorn that we get for Tom Barrass and pick 3 for Liam Baker 6 and 24, and essentially just hold a future second round pick next year. Now, at the end of the day, that's not really too different to the way we saw this playing out to begin with, in my opinion. What was sort of being the rumoured trade for Liam Baker was pick 14 for Liam Baker and pick 24. That was doing the rounds a little bit. So Richmond move up from pick 6 to pick 3, and they get a future late first in exchange for pick 24. Now, what are Richmond's needs here? As a side note, I mean, there's talk of them holding 7 top 25 picks in this year's draft, and how many of those will be in the first round? Probably like 4 of them. For a club that sees their rebuild being lengthy, I know it's a strong draft, but maybe there's some benefit for them to not sign 7 players on 3-year contracts who are then all going to be out of contract at the same time, and then all their extensions are going to be in line for a while. So in other words, maybe it's not too bad for them if they hold a second first rounder in next year's draft rather than take an extra one this year. I mean, that's really up to them. But at the end of the day, pick 14 has been taken out of our hands now. So it's kind of Richmond that are going to pay the price. Now, we can consider the contingencies here of, let's say this ruins the Liam Baker trade or the Tom Barrass one. So it is entirely conceivable that now Richmond say, stuff your West Coast, which is not really our fault. But if they did, and they decided to deal with Fremantle, and let's say Liam Baker's open to that, which from some reports suggests that he just wants Richmond to be compensated. It doesn't need to be West Coast. Although, on the other hand, he does want to get to West Coast. He wants to play with McQualter and Graham. So I'm not entirely convinced by that, but let's just explore that contingency. If Baker goes to Fremantle, fair enough. We lose out. That wasn't really our fault, to be honest. I would probably still be looking at trading 3 for 6 and 18 in this year's draft. I really want to bolster this year's draft hand. It's not great, particularly if some of these deals don't go down. So then we'd hold 6, 18, 26, and then a couple of picks in the 60s, and we'd have 2 firsts next year, thank you to Hawthorn as a result of Tom Barrass, which I think probably still gets done. But let's say if Tom Barrass has to stay, let's say this has completely ruined the relationship between them. In that scenario, like, do we still go for Baker? I mean, we could. Without the Tom Barrass deal, the only way we could really get this done is trading 3 for 6 and Baker, which kind of equates to pick 18 for Liam Baker, which Richmond can say no to, but that is still, that's kind of like one of our options. So long story short, it's been an interesting development, but I'm not too sure that this is going to throw everything into chaos. I suppose it really depends on the relationship between these clubs. Is Richmond going to tolerate what we get as a part of a deal for Tom Barrass now that it's in the future? We can't control that, and ultimately, you know, we can't really be blamed for it either. And Liam Baker's out of contract, so their best hope is Liam Baker getting to Fremantle and them getting a good deal, which is probably the case anyway. Like, it is better for Richmond if Liam Baker had chosen to go to Fremantle. So yeah, done the full circle of emotions. A side note here, Devon Robertson is exploring options at the Brisbane Lions. Again, this is something we've been forecasting a little bit on the channel. Now it's become fairly formal. I think he's actually indicated to Brisbane that he's exploring his options without necessarily nominating West Coast. Like, he could go to Victoria or something like that. I just want to make it clear right now that Devon Robertson, like, we need to be offering pick 63 at best for Devon Robertson. I mean, the guy played 3 games this year. Yes, he played some games for the Brisbane Lions when they were in the grand final, but he did it as a role player, as a pressure forward. He's not a proven AFL midfielder. Honestly, the contract doesn't really matter in this case because surely Brisbane don't value him that much. Let's be real. We're actually kind of doing them a favour here. But rather than, you know, on True Footy, I try to more map out what's fair. I'm just saying from a West Coast perspective, if you offer a future second round pick for Devon Robertson, Matthew Clark, I'm coming for you. If there is a scenario here, and this is a preemptive rant, nothing bad has actually happened yet, but I want to put this on record now. If there is a scenario where we trade Tom Barrass and effectively just get Liam Baker and Devon Robertson, I am going to, well, I don't know, I'm be very, very upset, and I will make a whole video about you, Matthew Clark. I know that's the last thing you want, Matthew Clark, a little nerd who lives in the UK complaining about you on camera. No, I'm just being silly, but I just want to make it clear, if there is any scenario where that plays out, where our compensation for trading an established player, which is meant to help our rebuild, and we get Liam Baker and Devon Robertson, I'm preemptively just putting it out there. I hate that so much, and you've been warned. Audience, you're going to hear a rant if that happens. But if it's pick 63 or something, maybe. Honestly, I'm kind of touch and go even at that price, considering we now have Jack Graham. Anyway, guys, there's still some more Eagles stuff to talk about. Like, we've just, you know, we've committed to Jared Schofield staying. John Worsfold's rejoined the club. I actually do want to make a separate video to that. It feels weird tacking it on to the end of a trade update, but there's just so much going on, and I'm busy with my other channel now. So I will make a video talking about some of the off-season changes and structural changes we've seen. And to be honest, we're still learning about some of them. Like, McQuote hasn't signed anyone yet. So I'll save that for the time being, because I do have some thoughts naturally. But let me know what you think in the comment section, Eagles fans, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.